Going to continue here with our main theme here on Triple Take, a focus in on inflation, particularly with that big number coming tomorrow here in the United States. We actually got some big numbers today, though. The World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates out of the USDA came out here. The big shocker was some of the estimates that we saw for soybean coming in a lot lighter than what the street was expecting, and we saw that big surge in soybean prices. Here to talk a little bit more about that, we want to bring in the chief economist over at the USDA, Seth Meyer, who's been actually doing this for a lot of years, not just at the USDA, but of course in the private sector as well. And Seth, I want to start off here more broadly, not just with soybeans, but really this idea of the sort of the persistent volatility that we've seen over the last couple of years in the commodity space, particularly when it comes to grains. And the idea that some of the disruptions there have nothing to do with the normal stuff that you would track, which would primarily be weather, planting, things like that.
Oh, absolutely. So I think we've got a combination of things. When you go back a couple of years, I think that's a great place to start, where you kind of go back to the fall of 2020 and the Chinese coming back into the global agricultural market strongly. Good demand. I think we've seen some trip ups on crops around the world, so some short crops around the world. And then I think you add to that the events like war in Ukraine, which is not something that we're normally used to predicting. And that's added an additional element that's taken supplies out of the market.
What about the events, if I can interrupt you, about a potential railway strike as well that we're hearing about?
Yeah, no, and I think it's obviously a concern, especially in North America at a time when we're beginning to harvest our crops, and it's a very intense shipping period. So it's something we'll need to watch very carefully, because again here, the length of this strike is critically important from a producer standpoint. I think also from a consumer standpoint, if you're in the baking industry, you're going to be looking for rail delivery of inputs into your baking product. And the most critical element in the recipe is the one that you don't have.
Overall, when you say, of course, for future planting, for future production, how much of the signs and the signals being something taken that the producers are in real time reacting to in longer term trends? Or do they feel that so much of this is unprecedented that for now they can't bake in higher temperatures on the longer term? They can't bake in, of course, issues from a geopolitical perspective?
So I think you're right. There's a lot of anxiety here because we've seen a lot of volatility on the output price side. But think about fertilizers. Think about energy use, which in North America, obviously, those are big components in terms of agricultural production. And the war in Ukraine's added volatility to those, too. So you're looking at extreme volatility in both the input and output side, and that gives producer anxiety when they look forward.
And then there's some of the longer term issues here, Seth, particularly when it comes to climate change. I remember it must have been like 10 years ago, maybe even longer than that. You would talk to some of the farmers who were in that sort of corn belt, and the idea that that corn belt was actually moving a lot further north than what it used to be in the past. This has been a long runway, and we know it's going to be even a longer time before we find a solution. But how do you factor that into some of your forecasts going forward if weather conditions change enough where what gets planted, at least in the states that we now would sort of traditionally plant them, changes?
So, I mean, that's just a long run effect, and those things move slowly over time. But I think we also see more immediate effects of climate extremes. For instance, we're in a contraction phase of the cattle cycle. So cattle prices are high, beef prices are high. And part of that's because we're seeing what we would normally think about of 100-year drought events occurring 2 or 3 times in the last decade in the West, really leading folks to trim their cattle numbers. And so I think we are seeing immediate adaptation to this. And I think it's something that producers are going to continue to have to adapt to longer run.
I'm from California, acutely aware of the drought issues that we face in the Central Valley, growing most of the food that you get. On that note, and this might be outside your purview a little bit, but curious if you can comment, with the climate change patterns, with the droughts, with the extreme weather patterns, how are farmers shifting? How are food patterns, consumers shifting behavior? How do you then train farmers to grow what is possible in those regions? Can you comment on that at all?
Well, I think we haven't had, producers are going to continue to have to adapt. And I think that they're going to have to, this need for adoption is going to have to grow as we see these climate changes become larger. If that's what we see, if we see changing climate, they're going to have to adapt more. But at the moment, I think producers have so far, it's production practices, it's going to no-till, it's attempting to make adaptation which makes me less sensitive to those climate extremes. Or maybe I'm going to grow sorghum that's less drought sensitive than some other crop. So I think in the short run, you'll see producers making some adaptation, but I think that adaptation gets bigger over time.